So it is my great pleasure to round out our day with a keynote speaker whose work has in many ways inspired this conference as well as the work of so many of the people here. Simone Browne is Associate Professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, where she researches and teaches in the areas of surveillance, social media, social network sites, and virtual worlds, as well as the Black diaspora. Her publications in these areas include her 2012 essay, Everybody's Got a Little Light Under the Sun, Black Luminosity and the Visual Culture of Surveillance, Digital Epidermalization, Race, Identity, and Biometrics, and Race and Surveillance as published in the Routledge Handbook of Surveillance Studies. Beyond these important early works, many of us are indebted to Simone's path-breaking first book, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, which was awarded in 2016 the Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize by the American Studies Association, the 2016 Surveillance Studies Book Prize by the Surveillance Studies Network, and the 2015 Donald McGannon Award for Social and Ethical Relevance in Community Technology Research. Dark Matters has been described as, quote, a theoretical tour de force to the field of surveillance studies. It brings together Blackness, Black life, and the Black subject, what she calls dark matter, into often uncomfortably vivid view. Her concept of dark surveillance, strategic practices of watching the watcher and engaging racializing surveillance in ways that critique and resist it by rendering oneself out of sight, is one that serves as an important touchstone for this conference. I am delighted to end out our conference by introducing to you our keynote speaker, Simone Browne.
Thank you, Tina, for that warm introduction. So what a wonderful day. I am so happy and honored and excited to be here at the 43rd Annual Scholar and Feminist Conference. And I appreciate the space made here today and also last night. Thank you to Tina Camp for inviting me to be here at Barnard College. I would also like to thank Pam Phillips for my travel arrangements, Avi Cummings, Sona Quigley, for their attention to, for their organizing and their attention to details and their kind words, and also Beck Jordan Young. So I just had this up here, I guess for us to ponder for a bit. I'm really inspired by the work of Ashaki M. Jackson and her poetry on surveillance. So last fall, when Tina Camp invited me to be part of the Subverting Surveillance Strategies to End State Violence conference, I told her that I'm working on something that I think might fit. I started to think about the drone violence and looking. I was interested in interviewing ex-drone pilots, analysts, and anyone who I could talk to about the business of remote hunting, targeting, and killing, a gruesome business. I spoke with someone with firsthand knowledge of the ins and outs, and they told me that perhaps a more interesting question is not one about looking, it's about the silence. This person told me that the obvious to them, there is no sound, except I'll add the sound of violence. I abandoned that project for now, not only to rethink it and its politics, but to rethink it by taking instruction from Tina Camp when she asks in her recent book, Listening to Images, what happens when we attempt to listen to images rather than merely view them? Where she writes, quote, listening attentively to mundane details means not accepting what we see as the truth of the image, and instead by attending to their lower frequencies means being attuned to the connections between what we see and how it resonates, end quote. She warns us to resist the easy readings. She writes, and I'll come back to that point a little later. Thinking through ideas takes time, and I'm okay with that. There's so much writing, critiquing, and thinking and creating that I'm really excited about that is critiquing the business of surveillance, or at least who gets the business end of surveillance. Much of which I heard about today. Toby Beacham's Going Stealth, Transgender Politics in U.S. Surveillance Practices, Ronak K. Kapadia's Insurgent Aesthetics, Inderpal Grewal's Saving the Security State, Aliyah I. Abdur-Rahman's The Enchantment of Being, the work of the Global Action Project, Ashaki M. Jackson, artists Daniel Dean and Sadie Barnett and Sandra Perry, and Mendy and Keith Obadike, and the tactical interventions done in terms of anti-surveillance by the Hyphen Lab Collective, to name a few. One of the things that I attempted to do or make an intervention with my book is what I saw at the time, at least, as an under-theorization of race within surveillance studies. I did this by asking how a realization of the conditions of Blackness, that being the historical, the present, and the historical present, can help social theorists understand our contemporary condition of surveillance. Or said differently, rather than thinking of surveillance as something installed by new technologies such as automated face recognition, voice-changing Snapchat apps, or filters, drones, backscatter machines at airports, or body cameras worn by cops, to see surveillance as ongoing, and by looking at its precursive formations, is to insist that we factor in how racism and anti-Blackness shape our present governing order in what is now the United States and beyond that formation. So in asking of that field of study, what instead of looking at Jeremy Bentham's design of the panopticon as metaphor, that's bingo number 2 for Christina, we take into account Bentham's own letters, where he wrote in a kind of throwaway manner that in 1785, during his travels to Russia, the place where he would eventually conceptualize his ideas around the panopticon, that in his journey to get there, he spent some time on board a slave ship where 18 young negresses, slaves in parentheses, were under the hatches. Taking account for this absented presence of Blackness, we might ask how the view from under the hatches is another site from which to conceptualize the operations of power. So starting from the unfreedoms placed upon Black women demands that we conceptualize the links between race and gender and surveillance and slavery and its afterlives. And it demands that we work towards, or we continue to do the work towards, something that looks like freedom. And in that work, I'm indebted to Black studies for doing the heavy lifting and the groundwork to get to that place that looks like freedom. As Ruthie Wilson Gilmore told us this morning, that freedom, not in the capital L liberalism type of freedom. Rod Ferguson, Angela Davis, Catherine McKittrick, Bell Hooks, Hazel Carby, Sadia Hartman, Patricia Hill Collins, Imani Perry, Miriam Kaba, and many, many more. Thank you. So I want to turn now to some moments and objects and excerpts and B-sides from my work, because I want to focus today on Black women's intellectual labor and creative output, our refusals, and I want to begin with the question again posed by Tina Camp towards the end of Listening to Images. It was a question of Black futurity that she posed, where she asked, quote, "How does a Black feminist grapple with the future that hasn't happened but must, while witnessing the mounting disposability of Black lives that don't seem to matter," end quote. The discrete parts that I turn to today are a file, a patent, a data set, and an installation. Part 1, the file. The declassified file that the FBI compiled over 18 years on Audre Lorde is short as far as these things go. 20 pages, some handwritten memorandum, some duplicates of other pages, a note on her poem Prologue, published in the journal Freedom Ways, all released through a Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. So the redaction here is not, that's mine actually. I was trying to do some redaction poetry with my marker. It's not actually how it was declassified. So in this file, she is one Audre Lorde, AKA Audre Lordess. Security matters, C. C is for communist. She first appeared in a memo dated September 9th, 1954, from the legal attaché or legat in Mexico City, the FBI's oldest overseas office. An informant, name redacted, told the Bureau that he met Audre Lorde in Oaxaca in June of that year, and that she is described as, quote, a 22-year-old Negro girl who says she resides in New York City on or near 7th Street. The informant told the FBI that Audre Lorde had been in Mexico since 1954, studying at the Polytechnique Institute in Mexico. The memorandum notes that when in Cuernavaca, Lorde resides at a residence where a number of known American communists from time to time have stayed. Here is a direct quote from a September 9th memorandum. The informant further stated, although the subject claimed not to be a member of the Communist Party, she did at least give the impression of following the party line in conversation. In other parts of the file, she described as a student at Hunter College or as a teacher of Black literature at John Jay College. One memo from June 1957 to the New York field office from Special Agent Joseph T. Quigley states that Audre Lorde was interviewed at her home for approximately 25 minutes. She is described as cordial and friendly throughout the interview. And when asked to give the matter of cooperating with the Bureau further thought, she said she was sure that she wouldn't change her mind. So now we know that in reading these documents, we need to be mindful of the original intent, that being mainly messages back and forth between field offices and headquarters that provide an interpretation, their interpretation of their surveillance and of their preoccupation and harassment with the captioned subject. So of course, it's a question of who the intended reader is. Often when a file is declassified, much of the original text is redacted or otherwise concealed, censored, or covered up with black bars and white blocks. But as American Studies scholar Anjali Nath in her research on FOIA files tells us, quote, redaction does not negate the possibilities of interpreting and making meaning of these files, end quote. So although the redactions made to the declassified file on Audre Lorde are few as far as these things go, I highlight this particular memo for the ways in which her refusal to cooperate comes through. She would not report on her friends. Cordial enough, she would not cooperate with the FBI and wondered why the FBI would be interested in her for that work. In Zami, a new spelling of my name, she tells us just as much when she writes, the day before the FBI agent stood in my doorway, Eva Perón had died in Argentina, but somehow we were a threat to the civilized world. Lorde also writes, the height of the McCarthy era, and I knew enough not to let them pass my door. They stood outside, stupid and male and blonde and a little bit threatening. She would not report on her friends. Part 2, the patent. In 1996, the year that marked the groundbreaking of the World Trade Center here in New York, Mary Van Britten Browne and her husband, Albert L. Browne, invented what they called a home security-based system on television surveillance. As they were concerned with crime and security, and they were tired of the slow police response to calls from distress from the public in cases of emergency, they filed a patent application on August 1st of that year. Mary Van Britten Browne was a nurse by profession, and she often worked the night shift. Her husband, Albert, was an electronics technician. On December 2nd, 1979, the United States Patent Office issued patent 3482037 for the couple for their audio-video alarm system for household protection that could remotely screen callers from inside the home. Mary Van Britten Browne is listed first on this patent and as its inventor, and it's now referenced in over a dozen patents. So the blueprint for this patent that you can see on the slide here details its ingenious intricacy. It includes a camera at the door entrance that a visitor can scan, that someone in the house can scan if the visitor is outside, an intercom, an alarm, audio recording capabilities, a remote control lock that could allow someone in the home to unlock the door even while lying in bed, as you see here. There is little published work on the life of Mary Van Britten Browne and the making of this patent. This closed-circuit television system that's a precursor to the contemporary remote home monitoring systems such as video doorbells and other DVR home surveillance devices for the consumer market. As such, this apparent absence in the official genealogy of this surveillance technology and its applications form part of a generalized absenting of Black women's contributions when it comes to the ways that surveillance is conceptualized and historicized. Given this absence, how, if in any way, could our relationship to and our knowledge of security and surveillance and its infrastructure be altered by knowing that there was a time when a Black woman from Queens, New York, played an integral role in the development of CCTV? The modern home security system has a patented history in a desire of a Black woman to create a way for her to live safely. I'd like to imagine that Mary Van Britten Brown came up with this idea while talking to other Black nurses who worked the night shift with her. And I'd like to think that they thought this technology was a way outside of calling the police. I'd like to imagine that they thought of this technology as a strategy for self-defense. And I'm thinking here of Imani Perry in her chapter, I Always Feel Like Somebody's Watching Me, what she terms a privacy marking gesture, where she writes in the discussion of driving through African-American homes and neighborhoods and seeing their blinds closed all the time, and seeing this move, as she says, as she writes, might be a cultural practice born of fear of violent white folks, or it might be a cultural practice indicating people's self-definition as rights-bearing, privacy-determining citizens. So these two objects, the FBI's FOIA file on Audre Lorde and Mary Van Britten Brown's patent 3482037, I think provide an entry to one of the urgent questions we've been grappling with today and as set out by the conference and plainly stated in the program. What are the ways to engage in self-defense against the demands of a militarized, racist police state? The refusal to report on your friends, and maybe even your frenemies in this case. And the creation of technologies, even though they might be imperfect for now. And so when I think of technologies here, I wanted also, let me just read what I have there before I riff a bit. So we should think of the term technologies, of course, more broadly than Mary Van Britten Brown's patents, but also along the lines of what Dean Spade said last night around mutual aid networks, or Ruthie's calls for yesterday of alliances with others. And so I also want to be mindful of Allison Birch is a researcher, a creator, and a maker here in New York City, and she uses the term called cop art, the kind of art that is in the service of the oppressor. And so I would want to be mindful of when we name anti-surveillance practices, performances, and ways that people get by and get around, that we be mindful of the spaces in which we do these things, recorded. These are not things that sometimes we want to audibilize. It has us then doing not cop art, but cop academia. Maybe it's always cop academia, I don't know, but so it's a question of who is our research for? We don't tell on our friends, but we also don't tell what our friends do. So, but for a lesson that I learned on technology, part 3, the Book of Negroes. In 2016, it was announced by the government of Nova Scotia, that's a province in eastern Canada. It was announced by that province that the Book of Negroes was added to its open data portal. The Book of Negroes can now be downloaded by researchers as a CSV file, where the data can be then filtered, queried, and aggregated, and developers can now have access to this ledger as an API and use popular computer programming languages like Python and JavaScript to build new applications out of this 18th century handwritten ledger that lists 3,000 self-emancipating Black people who embarked out of mainly British ships out of this city during its evacuation in 1783 after the War of Independence. The Book of Negroes is a ledger of Black escape, and the first government-issued document for state-regulated migration between the United States and Canada that explicitly linked the markers of Black people's bodies to the right to travel over that border. It was really the making of that border. So one of the claims that I made in Dark Matters is that by situating this ledger of Black escape and Black arrivals as a passport that tied descriptions of the body to the right to move was a way of making an important corrective to the history of the modern passport as intimately tied with the surveillance of Black people. And part of what Nandita Sharma referred to last night as the violence of identification, where biometrics understood in its simple terms of bio of the body and metrics pertaining to measurement has long been deployed as a technology in the surveillance of Black mobilities and the state's practices of containment. This is what Catherine McKittrick has called the uncomfortable mathematics of Black life. With this ledger, now a downloadable data set, gone is the description column from that ledger that indexes the over 3,000 self-emancipating Black people in that death by shorthand type of way that Saidiya Hartman warns us about when it comes to ledgers. Gendered nouns such as wench, fellow, lad, and girl, adjectives such as fine, stout, lusty, sickly, good-looking, idiot, or worn out, feeble, ordinary, or just ditto, ditto, ditto. Their names, like Suki and Thomas Brown, Fortune, and Child of Dinah, are listed on an Excel spreadsheet in column F for names. Just names, no longer Negroes' names, as the Negro in Negroes' names that was in the handwritten original is no longer in this revised data set. Unremarkable. Now evacuated in that familiar type of way that reflects a deep investment by the Canadian state, now and before, to empty itself of Blackness. Like the demolition of Africville in 1960s, a Black settlement in Nova Scotia, marked for quote-unquote urban renewal, or to the upcoming renaming of various sites in and around the province of Quebec, like Lac de Negre and the rapids on the Gatineau River, named by a racist slur because 2 Black people drowned there in the 1900s. Also missing from this new data set is the column for remarks, where crude annotations were made, some that served as biometric identifiers, such as scar on the forehead or small scar on her nose, some that marked these people's own claims as autonomous subjects, formerly slave of. She says she was born free, and likely rascal, who said he was his own property. And some that describe the changing same, came from Jamaica, I can't understand him. I still find that one funny. So gone too in this revised Book of Negroes data set is the column that lists the so-called claimants, if any, as a caveat was set out in the 7th provisional article of the 1783 Treaty of Paris that no property could be departed with. Not all who escaped from New York on those ships, some people did not escape. They were pulled off the very ships to come to testify unsuccessfully at Francis Tavern in New York City, a bar-turned-courtroom. They were arguing for their right to leave New York City as free people, and instead were delivered to their claimants to be disposed of as he may think proper, and put on a no-sail list, the no-fly list of that time. In the section Idle Concerns and Scenes of Subjection, Saidiya Hartman asks, quote, how does one narrate a story of freedom when confronted with the discrepant legacy of emancipation and the decidedly circumscribed avenues available to the freed? So this is the task of researching the Book of Negroes. Black people who would later be called Black loyalists by many or escaped property by some, who, as part of the stipulation with the Treaty of Paris, would be evacuated on British ships like the vessel Generous Friends and Providence and Venus, that would be, from what would become the United States. They would find themselves in pre-Confederation Canada in ports like Quebec and Halifax. Some arrived indentured to white loyalists. Others on those ships arrived under a continued condition of slavery or enslavement to white loyalists. They would find in Canada other enslaved Black people, other free Black loyalists who were evacuated from Boston in 1777 and largely unworkable and harsh land. Many labored on public works projects and fared slave catchers and faced possible recapture and deportation to the US and other forms of forced and coerced labor. As Black Canadian poet Sylvia Hamilton put it about the province of New Brunswick, this land does not forgive. We cut our way, entangled forests, back ache, hands, feet bruised, bodies broken. Post-emancipation Black life in Canada as is elsewhere, was and is contingent, an unfinished emancipation. The making of the Book of Negroes into quote-unquote big data comes with a silencing, missing columns, columns emptied out of Negroes' names. Now I have to contend with the new coding of the Book of Negroes, a coding that on the surface seems to make very little room for Black life. But I question if this archive is truly silenced by the revising and the digitizing of the ledger. A question that I think continues to shape my work is, what is lost and what can be made possible when Black life is made digital? What if we refuse the labels? What if we refuse the violence of identification and instead, as Catherine McKittrick tells us, trust the lies and not the numerical data? He says he is his own property. Perhaps new imaginings, ones that are more accessible, will come out of the Book of Negroes API, like that of the transatlantic slave voyage database. Perhaps new ways of plotting. But what of those left behind on the no-sale list who remained in New York City in 1783? When the law regulating the movement of Negroes and slaves in the nighttime was re-upped in 1784, it came with not only the requirement that, if not under the supervision of some white person, Black people were mandated to carry with them a lit lantern as a supervisory device. They were also forbidden from carrying weapons, trotting quickly on horseback, gambling, not using their indoor voices when outside and in the streets and making loud noises. Or they could be apprehended by any white person deputized through white supremacy to uphold such laws. The lit candle making its holders part of the lighting infrastructure of that city. We can see these laws as a precursor to, or as part of the ongoing stop and frisk policing practices where categories of suspicion could include furtive movements, matches of description, change direction at the sight of an officer, inappropriate attire for the season, Toronto police carding, known to the police, or as in the case of the cop who killed Philando Castile in front of his girlfriend Diamond Reynolds and her 4-year-old daughter, just because of the wide-set nose. We can make the links to these 18th century laws to the New York Police Department's omnipresence strategy, as Josh Scannell has pointed out in his dissertation, Electric Light, Automating the Carceral State. This is the practice where flashing lights from police cruisers and floodlights are projected onto so-called hotspots in so-called high-crime neighborhoods, exposing their occupants to a constant and high-intensity artificial light. This is part and parcel of the policing tactics like heat mapping, predictive policing, body cameras, stingrays, and fusion centers that, as Scannell tells us, are, quote, a set of techniques for leveraging algorithms to bathe the city in electric light, unquote. This outdoor lighting at night has harmful effects: severe glare, negative impact on human circadian rhythmicity, and the possibility that these white lights could suppress the production of melatonin. The loud hum of the floodlight tower generator itself is a noise campaign. And you can also think of this noise campaign happening now in Puerto Rico with the use of generators being structurally imposed by the government's refusal to just do better. What human life gets valued as infrastructure, but deemed non-essential and made disposable by our current governing order. The homeless hotspots at South by Southwest in Austin 2012, where unhoused and underhoused people were outfitted as human pay-per-use Wi-Fi hotspots, and they were given t-shirts that said just as much. I'm William, a 4G hotspot. Homeless hotspots were the brainchild of a brand strategy company based in New York that claimed that all of the proceeds from this proceeds paid for this Wi-Fi access would go directly to the person selling the Wi-Fi access. What human life gets valued as infrastructure? There are laws in some cities that require that when people are flyering or panhandling at the side of the road, that they must wear phosphorescent or glow-in-the-dark reflective vests. Oh, sorry, this was an image of the lantern law and an image from Instagram, a site where people are, articulating a critique of these technologies with the harsh, intense, artificial light in their home. But the image here is from artist Angela Hennessy's recent installation, Blacklit. Blacklit is Hennessy's intervention on lantern laws as a technology of unfreedom. It is a large ceiling light composed of both synthetic and artificial human hair, foam, sponge rollers, gold leaf, and copper wiring. Cords looped through chains. A suspended chandelier of black crocheted hair, underneath it being a site of performance. Hennessy writes, quote, "By reversing the purpose of the surveillance, claiming the right to stand in the light, and then speaking or reading within and by that light could become a kind of rebellion," end quote. I see it as a way of her using her outdoor voice and speaking back to the luminous glare. Hennessy's Blacklit is an example of what I tried to talk about in Dark Matters around creative text and the analytical interventions that they do. They allow me to begin to think with what Sylvia Wynter has called the practice of decipherment in her essay, Rethinking Aesthetics, Notes Toward a Deciphering Practice. In that short essay, Wynter contends that a deciphering practice, quote, seeks to identify not what texts and their signifying practices can be interpreted to mean, but what they can be deciphered to do, end quote, and how. A deciphering practice is a way of getting at what Ronaldo Walcott puts in his discussion of that same essay, a reconstituted universalism proffered from the vantage point of the subaltern and the dispossessed. Therefore, it moves towards making alterable our current governing order, rather than merely being an art criticism or a media criticism that gets enfolded into, as Wynter puts it, the instituting of the figure of man and its related middle-class subject. In another use of light, and in this case, the light from a mounted headset from a GoPro camera, the installation Coding, Braiding, Transmission is a collaborative one by Tamar Clark Brown and Isaac Kirikou, which explores, they write, the potential dynamic between braiding hair and coding as a tool for sending encrypted messages and resistive political action. We can see from these images here, Black women braiding each other's hair, with the idea that their motions of braiding are captured in some machine-readable way, which are then turned into bits of code. Black women's care work around braiding, the shared intimacies and the shared knowledges of this act is an important, I think, thing to look at, a site to examine, as we know that Black hair gets circumscribed as dangerous at airports and in schools. And as Audre Lorde tells us, Black hair is never just a hairstyle. You can't come in here looking like that, she was told, as she tried to enter the British Virgin Islands in the 1990s. Coding, braiding, and transmission gets us to think creatively about digital self-defense tactics, encryption and decryption, and the close networks of community here. But in thinking of digital self-defense, I want us to hold on to what Miriam Kaba told us this morning when she said that privacy is an abstraction for Black people. So when you have things like at-rest encryption, as opposed to end-to-end, like the at-rest of, my phone has a password on it or so, password protections, it's not much of a match, she tells us, to a punch to the stomach by a police or the cops. So how do we encrypt our bodies from bullets? And how do we encrypt our bodies from chokeholds and the slow motion death that we discussed in the last panel as well? I don't really have very much more to say on the topic of biometric technologies. I always love what Audre has to say, particularly in this tweet that last week. And I just also wanted to make this GIF. Sorry, I know that's a big touchy subject here. This GIF from Better Off TED. They did an episode on racial sensitivity. It's in 2009. Is someone laughing? And so this is where the motion detecting sensors of the automatic doors and water fountains and elevators around the fictional R&D department of Viridian Technologies don't seem to read Black people. Or what they say, it's not racist, it's just indifferent to Black people. And so they then put up a manual fountain that was only for Black people, and that's what the GIF is there. And as Shoshana Magnet just laid out for us, we know that these biometric technologies are a white supremacist heteropatriarchal formation. So what Alondra Nelson warns us in this tweet, I think, is precisely to resist the easy readings. Of course, accounting for and counting racism is important work, but our demands for inclusion when it comes to machine vision are not necessarily demands for justice. And we should take a lesson here from Dionne Brand on justice, where she said right here in 2017 at BCRW, "I do not write toward anything called justice, but against tyranny and toward liberation." To ask tyranny, she says, to bring us into being is just impossible. It just can't happen. So I teach a first-year signature course on surveillance where everybody gets a drone. I'm kind of like Oprah Winfrey on that day. And I envisioned it as like, I used to imagine when I was in Toronto growing up that people in high school would get like eggs to take home or baby dolls as a kind of like anti-teen pregnancy lesson. And I kind of took this as like an anti-drone lesson for them. We go outside and play. And of course, when I taught the second grade, I knew that play is learning and it's very important. And we play around with drone failure. At one time, I had all the signals set basically to the same one, and they all flew up on the roof and into the trees at one time. And so the experiment was over in about 10 minutes or so. This year, I had them watch this video on slaughter bots, and they read an open letter against autonomous weapons. So what these slaughter bots were basically like biomimetic drones that are like maybe shaped like butterflies or dragonflies or these flying insects or so. And they were face recognizing assassination machines. But the video was like quite brutal. Like they would have this, someone was talking at basically like an apple con, like a stage like this, and a drone would come in and find them using the face rec and then pow and blow up their head. And then there were like all these scenarios of school shootings and whatever. And then I sent it out on the email system, and I was like, maybe I should put a trigger warning on that. Probably not out of their fear, but like out of my fear that I would be on Fox News or something the next night. And that's like a serious wonder for me. This semester I had a student in my class that said that she was a ghostwriter for Karl Rove. She dropped the class after a couple weeks though. So, and then there was this student last year that worked for Ivanka. I won't say her last name, but you know who I'm talking about. It's Texas. I mean, and the students can also walk with guns if they like, so sometimes those are like the least of my worries. So killer bots are, these killer bot assassinations are already happening, as we know, at wedding parties, in funerals, in places that are then renamed theater of wars, against people who are then renamed insurgents. The violence of identification, as Nandita tells us. We have drones walking around and driving around this city now in the form of cops outfitted with body cams and guns. Oh, okay. I started at 4:30, right? Okay, yes, I'm almost finished. So as a way to close this talk, I returned to where I began with the FOIA FBI file. When I went to see artist Sadie Barnett's Complan exhibition here in New York last fall, I went to see up close her rendering of the declassified file of the FBI's like almost 500-page file of their years-long surveillance of her father, Rodney Barnett, and is organizing organizing work as a member of the Black Panther Party in California. The file began in the late 1960s. She annotated those files, embellishing them with neon and lavender and black spray paint, bright plastic jewels and crowns and other matter to get them to tell another story. A story that is different from the FBI's redaction and non-disclosure and the memos of their surveillance and harassment campaign that targeted her father as an internal threat to the nation's security. And I would like to thank Jenna Wortham and Kimberly Drew for introducing me and providing me with the opportunity to meet Sadie Barnett. She tells a different story with her annotation that she says raises the volume of the daughter's voice, her voice. What continues to stick out with me from the comp plan are not only the files, but this picture here on the right. Sadie Barnett's work here demands that we listen to the images of what she terms disappearing Black cities. This call, and I'm echoing Tina Camp here, to listen to the images, like Winter's essay on deciphering practice, is a call for us to continue to reshape our imaginaries of our current governing order in the making of our anti-colonial futures. And I'll pause here because that's where I was going to end, with a call to not report on our friends, to create new technologies, and for self-defense. But I also, one of the many things that is going to stick with me today is this morning when Christina Heatherton asked us to see surveillance as the anxiety of a state aware of its own illegitimacy. To see it as an anxiety is to help us is to know that it knows the state, and we're not thinking, and Ruthie reminded us that the state is not an actor, it does not think. People act. But just in the shorthand now, that the state knows its own finitude, and that's what that anxiety stands for. And with that knowledge of its anxiety, of its finitude, of its illegitimacy, that is where the work can start and has started for us to think through subverting surveillance and the end of violence as a method of self-defense. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's it. I made a GIF, and I also wanted to think about how we use images from these sites as well. And so I know we have quite some time to talk about 45 minutes, but I also, this is like a brain trust of so many important thinkers and creators and makers and workers and that do the labor of rethinking surveillance. And so I hope that this can operate not as a kind of, what do we call these things, comprehensive examination Q&A, but as a conversation with this audience. I know some of our panels were short, so we have a time to get this thing done. Thank you.
How do we share this important information? We're always encouraged not to use social media, and how do we share this kind of information when we, are encouraged not to?
And I guess it's the way that you also use social media. So for example, I have 7 Twitter accounts, only basically 1 or 2 people know about. Some of them are just not working. But I mean, there's those things as well too. But there was the workshop on self-defense that people had. Of course, sharing is important. Code switching in those spaces is important as well to share. You know, I told somebody once, yeah, I don't believe in encryption. Doesn't seem not everybody's using. I'm lying. Yeah, you look shocked, right? But it's the idea that you know, right now that not enough people are using these technologies, so it's easy to focus on what needs to be decrypted. But if we use it for the mundane, then more and more, I think the technology might improve, and it might make for a more workable use of them. But I don't necessarily know if I am the one to say what we should go and do when there are people doing already. I mean, sometimes I try to historicize these things, like the use, like SNCC's use of the wide area telephone service as an alternate to, you know, calling a 911 or calling a police that will then come and over-police you or police you as it is. So those are some tactics I think we can kind of look to the past for that. But that's not to say that, you know, the panelists here were not, earlier today, we're not discussing those things or so. But I think those spaces are making, like the social media sites are important sites of intervention, and we shouldn't discontinue using them, but to be aware of, as Mark Anthony Neal says, that we don't own the servers. Yeah.
My question has to do with the conversation around biohacking, and if you think that is a viable field if you're trying to take back some sort of institutional power around the technology, because, I mean, there are people that are doing anti-surveillance makeup or whatever, but it's not developing as fast as the surveillance technology itself. And a lot of people I know are doing like RFID installation chips, but there's also like lawsuits with the corporations that are saying that like if you put it in your body, then like they still own it, therefore they may also own part of you. So, and whenever I talk to biohacking spaces, they don't really want to address the history of racism within that community. So I guess my question is, do you think that there's potential in biohacking if we're looking towards like a future that includes Afrofuturism and freedom and stuff?
I mean, there could be. I haven't seen any potential. A lot of it, maybe I'm not thinking of it now, but a lot of it I see is kind of performative with the face, you know, makeup and all of that stuff, and not really questioning the social conditions that would require people to the gentrification that happens, that more cameras come in. But and I think Harriet Washington talked a little bit about this and informed us about the use of these RFID that people call ubervalence, like the subdermal use of these kinds of chips, like chip your dog, chip your grandma, wandering type of things. But that even though if they're medical grade, they still could wander in the body and get lost, calcify, harden, and become you know, dangerous technology. So I think there should be some regulation around then. But when it comes to race and biohacking, I don't quite know about what that could look like. I don't do the kind of speculative work. I don't think I have that kind of creative energy. I leave that for the artists to do that work. But I really, when I asked that question earlier, like what could we do to encrypt our bodies, I think there was an interesting project that came from Misha Cardenas and also I think Patrice Cullors from Black Lives Matter, and they created this like bulletproof clothing as an intervention, but also as a serious kind of abolition technology. And maybe that is the kind of, you know, we're not all Black Panther with the armored suit, but maybe we can think about those kinds of ways of arming ourselves. Sorry I didn't answer your question too well, but I will think about it a lot more. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation. And I guess I also want to do what you just asked us to do, which is to sort of bring the previous discussions into conversation. And like you, I was also deeply inspired by Christina's description of surveillance as an articulation of anxiety and an acknowledgement of illegitimacy. And so I kind of want to pass this
Yes,
mic to
yes.
Christina or to you
Yeah.
to actually think about what that means. Because one of the things I've been thinking about is, yes, okay, how do we marshal the state's anxiety to our own? How do we leverage that towards non-sovereign forms of freedom, right? And it seems like the place that I get tripped up is in thinking about, or in anticipating, right? Anticipating a bee sting, right, in a lot of ways, which is once you identify that anxiety and you target that anxiety, or you try and subvert that anxiety, right, it intensifies right back at you, right? And so I'm trying to think my way beyond my own anxiety about soliciting that intensification, right? And that is also, I mean, and it also comes back around to Ruthie's point about, is that my moment of normalizing, right, a certain kind of victimization that is going to hinder my progress towards thinking beyond it, right? And so, like you, this is a brain trust, and so I would just love us to have a conversation about what that might mean, right?
I think we're going to pass the mic. Not so much? No. No, pass the mic to the audience to answer the question. And I think we have such a great opportunity to have a conversation about what really matters, what's important, and that question that you raised to think about Black futurity. What does that look like in our moment right now? What can we imagine? What has to have happened, as you put it? It's wonderful work.
Thank you so much, Simone.
Thank you.
And this one I have to own, my FBA. I mean, share, not own. Share. And I'm really ADHD, so I might forget to ask my question. But, I mean, seriously. So just to build on this, I actually have a question for this question or observation. I really can't look at that. That the state is aware of its own illegitimacy. I actually think that maybe that's true and not true. Like, this is totally friendly. I think it's true, and I think it's also not true, because there is an extent to which, even with the completely universalizing forms of surveillance that we talk about, in the context of the United States, the fact that the entire UK pretty much is on CCTV outdoors and so forth, I think there actually is, again, in common sense, a lot of legitimacy to these very powers and apparatuses and operations. Indeed, I was thinking while you were talking and earlier today about how we have this hope that the vulnerable communities writ large about whom we speak think these things, and we're merely giving them voice. But we know experientially that is not the case.
Yeah.
And I'll give an example, which was when the second Gulf War started under George W. Bush, I was doing prison visits in California as a paralegal. And these guys who were in the security housing unit, that's the prison within the prison, of the California State Prison at Corcoran, were most concerned about talking to me about whether we, California Prison Focus, would petition Sacramento to ensure that they would have an evacuation strategy for them when the terrorists hit Corcoran, right? So it's that kind of level of complexity, which I'm not calling ignorance at all, I am calling common sense, that makes me wonder, just wonder, that's all.
Hi, Professor Browne. It was great hearing you in person, because I just taught your book in a grad seminar, and it all came together very well, so thank you. So in the spirit of thinking out loud together, I also wanted to ask, like, some of the critical surveillance studies which comes out of the US is so US-centric that our imagination and hope in critiquing the surveillance industry is as if there is something we can get by critiquing it, when globally, like I'm talking about the context of India, where we just, this kind of surveilling violence is the very foundation of the civil society, right? So if the conversation is just about critiquing surveillance and not imagining how violence is the foundation of civil, so I'm with you on that, but I just find this so frustrating at times because we're so locked in imagining just US, right? So how can we, like I am with you in thinking about trans US, Canada. So that was like a place to get out and think internationally. So I'm just wanting to think it out loud how this form of surveillance is the foundation of our like the civil society.
Yeah, because like we're swimming in it right here in New York, and that's why there's a kind of overdetermination. I mean, not New York, but the U.S. in what at least I focus on and what other people might focus on. But as you know, as Inderpal Gurwal talked about today, around the use of the fingerprint in India as foundational to the colonial management around race in that space, and that kind of not kind of, but it's a direct correlation, I think, with the biometrics enrollment that is demanded of in that state at this moment. And so how we get in that conversation is not to demand that surveillance study cites us or be in conversation with us, but be in conversation with the work that's already happening, not only in the US, but beyond, that is thinking and organizing transnationally. So I think it's about our citation practices, and at least in terms of like any discipline, it's like not to demand that it recognizes us and our projects as important. Not to demand that it recognizes us and our projects as important that they are, but not to require that it demand for us to do our work. And so yeah, it's like haters. That's fine. But I do want us to talk about the connections that you're making about getting outside of our space and ourselves now a bit more. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. What do you think the Link NYC terminals say about us as kind of rights-bearing individuals? They kind of cropped up without kind of asking anyone whether we want Bluetooth beacons and cameras all over the city.
I actually don't know what Link NYC is.
So there are those terminals like all down Broadway with cameras and free public Wi-Fi. And
Oh, okay.
their parent company is owned by Alphabet.
Google, yeah.
Yeah. So I was just wondering if you could speak to maybe how you've seen corporations and like corporate urban Google blending with the state and how that's impacted our freedom, if that's something you've thought about.
Not really, but there are people doing that work, particularly around the city of Chicago. David Murakami Wood is someone who's thinking about cities and infrastructure. There's some work at how these particular companies work in terms of like the U.S.-Mexico border and the use of ground sensors, and not only like human agents, but also cameras, drone technologies, and other types of tracking as well too. So I'd have to think more about what you're talking about, but I assume these are free terminals. And so, when things are free, they're not really free. And so it's almost like, them dropping a stingray in a city and letting you, hook up your Wi-Fi there. And in that way, I would wonder, what kind of other data is being released when you do that. And so that's the thing, I think, with your question when I made this joke about encryption, why these kinds of things are important. Not to say that encryption would work in that way, but like, the stuff I have on my phone, I might not be vulnerable, but my students might be vulnerable, my colleagues might be vulnerable, and in that way we have to do a kind of collective protection and a collective kind of critical consciousness about how we use free Wi-Fi and other types of things that are free, like Snapchat and Facebook and Twitter and all of these spaces in which we share information derived from our body measurements.
Thank you so much. I've read your book. I use it into my work. And I actually wanted to make a comment on from the gentleman here, because I also think and use in my work the idea of how does it fit within a global picture of global forms of racialization. Are you familiar? There was Suspect Identities by Cole, and he talks about the way it was used on colonial subjects, particularly nomadic groups within West Bengal by British officers to, the fingerprinting. And then I was thinking about this in relation to your book of how surveillance has always been racialized. And I really appreciate you bringing in the gendered aspect too, because that seems to be lost within talking about how forms of control and social regulation are also gendered and racialized at the same time. I really appreciate this work. I was thinking just now, based on what you said, this use of social media and this compulsion that we feel even obligated to share information, not necessarily in a way of thinking about it in surveillance of the state on us, which in New York City, police have been known to use that to collect certain young people and put them into gangs, quote unquote, based on just pictures of people coming together and being taken of without you even having a moment. But then thinking about this form of surveillance and the pressure that a lot of young people feel to surveil themselves, really, and to share. And then maybe if you can have a conversation about that. I don't know if this makes sense, but thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. And I'm kind of losing my train of thought that there was a study that came out from the ACLU in Boston last week, I think, with Katie Crawford, that looked at the Boston Police Department's use of this particular company's data analytics around, they were scouring Twitter feeds, open feeds for words like, terms like Black Lives Matter, Muslim Lives Matter, and other types of things that you could see how race and Islamophobia shapes their who they decide to deem to be subject to their intensification of their gaze just through using those sites that we might use to communicate and to articulate a claim and a demand that Black Lives Matter, but they're using that as a hashtag to police people as well. So that's what I was, that report is very an important one that came out last week. And I think we could open up that conversation or continue the questions too. Thank you.
Hi, my question builds off, it can be related to that report, and I feel like I'm noticing in a lot of civil liberties organizations and organizing around technology, we get into the discourse of whether something quote unquote works or doesn't work, and I feel like kind of frustrated and stuck in that. So we hear like, this is racist, and also it doesn't stop crime, quote unquote, or this is problematic because it violates personal privacy, and it doesn't ever show to stop terrorism, quote unquote. So I feel like wondering from everyone and from you, like strategies about avoiding work doesn't work, because whether or not that's even the intention of the project is a question, right? If the intention of the project is control of Black and brown people, and that's working well, and whether or not the additional project of stopping crime, like, and also, are we willing to submit to that sort of control and violence in order to stop other types of violence allegedly? So just thinking about strategies of how we talk about the technology in other terms besides work doesn't work. And one, just to like throw it out there too, another database that I don't hear that comes up a lot, that goes unchallenged a lot, is the criminal quote unquote offender record database that people stay in so that we can continue to punish them until they're dead, even after they've come home from the cage. So not forgetting that older school database that continues to haunt people that are in it.
No, thank you for that. So, so that work doesn't work is sometimes like a shorthand for recognizing these technologies failures sometimes, but that we can, work, they're imperfect, but we can create our other ones, our own, but also work to use them and to make use of them better. But I am mindful of, I'm gonna continue to be mindful of that distinction that you're making,
So, okay, I'm going to ask you the Canadian question. So, well, no, because I loved your talk, and as a 19th centuryist and also as a Canadian, just like really thinking about that border, and we were talking about it earlier. And this is not a surveillance question, but like really a disciplinary question, and picking up on that gentleman's question about the transnational, which is, historically there's a tension between Black studies and the transnational, and I'm wondering how you're thinking about anti-Blackness transnationally as it moves across borders. And then that's my first question. And then my second question is, how is Black studies or like what is being opened up by thinking about that, the 49th parallel, as opposed to the other borders that we tend to concentrate on?
Yeah, those are two great questions. The first one is I'm not a historian, as you know, or a disciplinarian or anything like that. But to get to that, so I referenced an essay from 1990 from Audre Lorde of Is Your Hair Political, where she experiences being stopped momentarily as she tries to enter the British Virgin Islands. She's stopped because her hair is in dreadlocks. Her friend, their traveling companion that she's with, her hair is braided. And eventually she was told that you can't enter. And that as the rest of the essay goes, the white pilot came and asked what was up. But one of the things that that stuck with me there, and it makes me think of like my experiences with Black women doing that surveillance work at the TSA and the hair scans, that she talked about being in the Caribbean and being an example of Black people using using like the tools of the oppressor against each other, the border, the hair searches, these types of things. She calls them the enemies of our weapons, she says in that essay. And so that is like how I think transnationally about anti-Blackness. It is everywhere. As we know, the plantation, as Catherine McKittrick and others have told us, is foundational, not only in this formation that we have here in North America, but in other spaces. So, and their second question about I don't want to say I don't think that much about Canada in my work, but it's always so present. So I would leave that to the to the people doing specific work on Black Canada, like Ronaldo Walcott, Dion Brand, and other folks in that area, and some of the new work that is situated not on Caribbean arrivals in the 70s and the 60s, but arrivals in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s around East Africa in particular. And so, I guess in my work, how I think it could be maybe an assistance in some way is to think about the stop and frisk practices that happen transnationally, the carding in Toronto, illegal carding by the police, to the continuing practices that happen here. So maybe one day I'll return to the 49th parallel. My geography is quite bad too, but yes, I don't know what that is. Thank you.
Thanks, Simone. That was so wonderful.
Thank
I was
you,
really happy to hear that talk. I have a question continuing the discussion about the relationship between identification and identity, particularly in relationship to surveillance. And I'm thinking again also about the fingerprint in India. 1859, only 2 years after the Indian Rebellion, and its relationship to insurgency, right? And the control, the kind of counterinsurgency that the British Empire engaged in after that time.
Oh, thank you.
Part of the process that was taking place throughout the British Empire at that time, and then other empires followed suit, was the separation of various people in the colonies according to biopolitical categorizations. So in India, for instance, this is the period in which Hindus and Muslims were really divided and separated as somehow discrete and separate types of people, so in that kind of racialized imagination. And those identities were really taken to heart, right? So you have like this relationship between state counterinsurgency methods and eventually personal identities of people, like I am Hindu or I am Muslim. And now we have a Hindu fascist government in India that has really taken it to heart and put it into policy, right? And enacted it very violently on Muslim bodies in India. So I'm wondering if you can talk about whether you're seeing in contemporary surveillance strategies and in contemporary insurgencies, whether there's also this kind of new subjectivities that are being formed, either that are actually insurgent or that are kind of being enfolded back into what the state actually wants us to think we are.
This is a comprehensive exam then. Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna need a minute. Can I get the question behind you?
Hi.
Cite my sources, Ruthie said.
All right, take a moment.
Yeah.
And then I had wanted to respond to, actually earlier, the idea about the state feeling the anxiety, kind of, and whether or not it's conscious or unconscious. And the reason I think it's important, and I agree with the person that spoke and said that it's very highly likely it is an unconscious anxiety at this point. And that unconscious anxiety of the actors in the state actually can have a tremendous reaction and response when it's poked. And I say that only for us to be aware in whatever endeavors we're in, that may be a response, that when those actors are more conscious of what's going on, the response may in fact be less violent. And that brings me to the question about the fear potentially about poking it, and how what, and reminds me of, believe it or not, in the New York Times recently, there was an article about Frederick Douglass and the whitewashing of Frederick Douglass, and the closing paragraph is a quote in which, and I'm going to bastardize it unfortunately, so I apologize, but he says, I mean, he's very clear, he says, those that are in the positions of power will keep that power only to the degree that those that don't have power are not in fact pushing them. But be careful, but be aware that the response that we're going to get will also be violent. So just as and I don't mean that as a downer, I mean it more to be aware and conscious of how much work, in a way, and how clear we need to be in various ways about what we're doing.
I wanted to raise a couple of issues. One is the question of the terminology we use. So when we say terrorism, and the question of state power and so on, and the whole monopoly of the state on power, if you can speak about that.
To speak about terrorism?
Yeah, I mean the whole question of the definition. When we're talking about the conference is about subverting surveillance, and the whole question about how things also are constructed in the knowledge that we produce. And so if you can speak about that, and what do you think about it? Because I was actually reminded when somebody said, well, it's not going to stop terrorism. And in my mind always, every single time somebody says that, I think about, so who defines terrorism? What is terrorism? What's state terrorism? And so on. It might be a bit rhetorical, but I think it's the second question is the bigger, for me, is a political question, part political, part intellectual thinking about it, is the question of Israel. And it's, of course, part of my own work, but it's not only a special interest issue, is the question to which Israel as a definition, whether we're talking about the Israel right-wing industry that overlaps with Islamophobia industry very much in order to discipline, silence, and not only silence Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, but also silence communities of color, indigenous communities, anybody who rises to question. And today it's becoming actually much more conflated with white supremacy, or maybe not conflated, but there is the alliances and so on. So I'm always thinking about that as somebody who does Palestine and works in Palestine, are we, as those who are doing this work, are we exaggerating? Are we thinking that this is a very important issue that we want everybody else to talk about and so on? Is this something that is actually a very important, because there is a lot of places and a lot of ways to think about it in multiple communities, including in the black community, right? It's not just in the black community, in multiple places in terms of disciplining things. So my question, my issue, and please bear, because I'm trying not to actually shortchange the question. My question is always when we talk about, people talk about the deadly connection, the ways in which the FBI and the Israeli are collaborating with each other. One of the problems in our own communities and our circles is that the accusation that the FBI only becomes lousy and bad, and security agencies only because Israeli security agencies train them. And those of us who basically are part of the settler colonial racist analysis think that's no, both are rotten and they all feed into each other and so on. But it becomes very difficult to shortchange these things because the analysis is not widespread enough. So what do you think about all of these things? I'm sorry
all of that?
Yes.
When I spoke of the noise campaign of the generators, that is a terrorism as well. When I spoke of Sadie Barnett's work with her father's FBI file, he was named as a terrorist, as a threat to the national security of the state, along with the Black Panther Party. And so when they were doing the work of self-defense. And so that's, I think, gets to Nandita question around identity and identification. And the last year when it came out with a new identification, it's a comprehensive category, comprehensive exam category. I was going to say the Black extremist identification that the FBI came up with as a new kind of reformulation as a way to criminalize Black protest and Black liberation movements. And so those are the state's naming practices. But within that document, they named those that are resisting. They didn't particularly name Black Lives Matter, but we knew that they were who they were talking about, and that became the alibi and the justification for increasing intensification and clamping down on movement work in that space. And so, with the state's identification, that with the new category didn't change the old work and the new work that's continuing to be done. And so, I guess those are two spaces in which I'm going to continue to think about those terms of terrorism and identification. I've been looking at identification at the site of the document or at the site of facial recognition, but there's something, I guess, more to say when we think of it as like, when we use your term, the violence of identification. So your question was like, are we exaggerating? Yeah. But I'm always asking other comrades and other colleagues. Yeah. What's the space? Yeah. And And it reminded me of your panel on Friday when Dylan Rodriguez said that we need to tell better stories. And you said something along the lines of, like, we tell our stories, but do people really care? And then he went back to talk about, there needs to be a kind of guerrilla warfare. And I think there are, or back to those strategies, but I think that there are strategies there around propaganda that we could, because I'm just writing and playing with drones with my students, but that people are doing, when we come to like rethink our stories so that it matters. And Yeah. I don't want to say very much more. I want to think through it a bit more. Yeah.
So we're at the end of our time together, and I just want to end by thanking all of you for the wonderful conversation and participation. I want to thank Simone again for an amazing presentation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone.